Alright, well, welcome to this Blender tutorial where I'm going to teach you how to make some tribbles in Blender. So first I'm going to open up a previous file that I have saved, which is already completed, so you can see what the final setup is going to look like. Let's show a 3D view here. Alright, so we've got right here our tribbles on a little control panel. And in the background, we've got a background plane, some sun lamps, and a camera. Well, let's get started by opening up a new file in Blender. Alright, so we're going to switch the render engine over to Cycles Render, and we don't need this default cube. Alright, so the first thing you're going to want to do if you haven't already done this is you're going to want to go to your user preferences, and there is an add-on that we're going to be using, so click here on add-ons, and it is import images as planes. So if you type import, see right here, import export images as planes, just check it, save your user settings, and X out. This is going to allow us to bring in both the image for the background plane and for the control panel. So that is actually what we're going to work on first, is the control panel. So under mesh, now you probably won't have as many options here. I have a few more add-ons installed. Chances are it'll just go these regular solids and a few polygons, and then grid, monkey, and images planes. You can also go to the import images planes. I like to use Shift A for the add images planes. Alright, so let's see. There we go. This is lcars.png. This is an image I got from the internet. It's a reproduction of one of the engineering panels from Star Trek: The Next Generation. Doesn't matter in particular which one you get. Just find one that's a pretty accurate Star Trek panel. I went with Next Generation because it is easier to make a control panel from Next Generation than it is from the original series, because those panels were all they actually had three-dimensional buttons that you had to press, whereas in Next Generation they were just flat touchscreens. So that makes it a little bit easier. Now, when you import this image as a plane, it will already be set up to project the image on the plane, and it will have a diffuse shader. So we're actually going to modify that slightly. So over here, the node editor. So we've got this diffuse shader, and we can change that to an emission shader. Alright, so now it will always be emitting that light. And actually, I want it to emit a little bit more than just 1. Let's give it 1.5. There we go. Alright, so in order to make it look like this is actually projecting light from behind a glossy surface, or on a glossy surface, what we're going to do is with Shift A, add an add shader. So the difference between an add shader and a mix shader, which is what you would more normally use, is that with a mix shader, the two shaders are simply being mixed together. Whereas with the add shader, any place one shader is more than 0 in brightness on any number, it will be added to that. So for instance, if you had two diffuse shaders added together, they would actually reflect more light than fell on this single diffuse shader if both of them were white. So normally you wouldn't use the add shader for most things because it's not physically accurate. However, if you have something that's glossy that's also emitting light, for instance a TV screen, or in this case a touch screen, then using the add shader with the emission can help you simulate that. So we add this, and notice a few things. One, our roughness is too high, and also there's too much of this reflectivity. So normally with a mix shader, if there's too much glossy, you can just turn down the slider. The add shader doesn't have a slider. It's always simply adding the numbers together. So the way that you simulate turning down that glossy is simply by turning down the color here. So just take the value down, and that looks pretty good. So we're going with a value of 0.373, feel free to experiment. There's a fair chance that we'll change it later once we get the lighting set up. And we're going to change this. Let's see what 0.1 looks like. I like that, but let's see what 0.05. Yeah, we'll go with 0.05 for now. All right. So if we just quickly go into rendered view here, we can see that, yeah, this is emitting light and also reflecting light from our lamp. If we were to add, say, a cube, you can see that, yep, it's emitting light. So yeah, that is a control panel material. It's pretty good. I think it looks pretty accurate. Now, if you want this to be even more accurate, you might actually want to put a transparent plane over the control panel and have that be glossy. But I think that's far more trouble than it's worth. It's going to seriously increase the amount of work your computer's going to have to do. I just don't think it's really worth it for most scenes. So I'm going to hit Z to come back into wireframe. Now we're going to select this by right-clicking, tab into edit mode, and we're going to make this actually a bit more complicated because I'm sure if you've ever watched Star Trek, you know that the control panels aren't two-dimensional planes. So we're going to hit E to extrude. We're going to extrude this down. Okay. So I'm actually going to hit back into textured mode so you can see how this is looking. Alright, that's a little thick, so I'm going to bring this up a little bit on the Z-axis by grabbing the handle, just dragging it up. That's with left mouse button. Right, we also need to give this a little bit of thickness around the edges. So I hold with the face select, because I hold Alt on one of these lines here and shift click, and that will select the whole loop around. What I'm going to do is hit E to extrude, but then I'm going to right click so it snaps back to where it was. Now this is a little trick for when you're scaling. If you scale and hit X, Y, or Z, it will limit your scaling to that axis. But if you hit Shift X, Y, or Z, it will limit it to the two axes besides that one. So if I hit Shift Z and I hit S, well, after hitting S to scale, you can see that now it doesn't actually scale on the Z-axis, but it will on the other two. So that can help us get established. I'm going to hit 7 to go to top view. And you can see that the edges... Oh, I didn't actually get it to spin. Alright, try that again. There we go. So in top view, and hit 5 to go to orthographic, you can see that it's scaled out a lot more here than it is here. That's simply because this object is longer on the x-axis than it is on the y-axis. So now we're just going to hit S and Y to scale only on the S-axis, and what you want to do is get the lines going from the corners on the inside to the outside to be roughly 45 degrees, so that way the margins on the y-axis are about the same as the margins on the x-axis. So there we go. If we take a look after tabbing out of edit, we can see that this is a much more appropriate thickness and size for the panel. Hit Z to go back into solid view. And you know what? Take a look at textured. Alright. So here's one thing though. We don't actually want this to show up as glowing, because there shouldn't be anything glowing from underneath this panel. So there's a few things we can do, but I think the easiest thing to do is simply going to be to change the material. So what we're going to do is plus here with our materials tab out, add a new material. We'll call this black. We're just going to leave this with diffuse, click here, all the way down. So that way it's just not going to have any reflections. It's going to be simple. And yeah. But the last thing we need to do, because this is not actually this material yet, is with this face selected, or with all the vertices selected, hit assign, and there you go. You can see it's changed colors to white. That's because in the settings, our material color for this material is white. We can change it to a dark gray or something. Okay. Here we go. Now if we go back into rendered view, see, alright, we get a nice little panel with some thickness to it. There's no glowing underneath. We get glowing on top. Remains nice and glossy. And actually, I'm thinking that glossy might actually be too rough still. So, expand my glossy shader here. Get it down to 0.025. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. You're always going to need to experiment, and it's always going to change throughout the time that you're constructing the scene. And one of the reasons for that is that no two scenes are going to be identical. You're going to have different lighting setups, different camera setups, all that. So just because you set up a material and it looked good in one instance doesn't mean the same material will actually look good in all instances. And while I've done these types of materials before, you never really know exactly how it's going to work out. So the other thing is, if you look at some reference images of panels in Star Trek, you'll notice that they never have these hard-edged corners that we've got here. They always are kind of rounded. So in order to get that look, what I'm first going to do is I'm going to put an edge loop with Control R right here in the middle. And this is just to make sure that when I subdivide this object, it maintains a more even thickness here at the edges. So hit Control 2 to give it a 2-time subdivision. Now we can see it's just an ugly oval. Well, that's okay. We can still fix that. So the first thing we're going to do is, in edit mode, tabbed into edit mode, tab is the hotkey for that. We can go to edge select and select with Alt right clicking this edge. So basically all these corner edge loops. And Shift Alt will allow you to select more than one. So I'll Shift Alt, click, click. Alright, now we're going to slide this little sidebar open. And right here under mean crease, this basically tells Blender how smooth to make these subdivisions. So at 1, it basically just isn't subdividing them at all. So you can see that it's still rounding out the edges around here, just keeping these perfectly straight. We don't really need to be quite that harsh a edge crease, so let's go with 0.95. Well, actually, that didn't work out super well. So we're going to leave it. Let's see. Let's try something different. So I'm going to put 2 edge loops in. Scale them on the x-axis. Right. 2 edge loops in here. Scale them on the y-axis. Now there we go. That's actually a pretty good shape. But watch what happens when I go back into rendered mode. Yeah, that's not quite what we want. So the reason this happens is that when you use Control R to add in edge loops, it simply subdivides what's called the UVs. And we'll go over UVs right now. So if we slide this little guy over to open up a new tab, and then over to UV image editor. So if I hit A couple times to select everything, what's happening is that Blender is using a map of these vertices on a 2-dimensional plane with U and V axes to describe where the image is going to appear on the 3D model. So this is actually an easy fix because we use import as planes, so we know that the original inside margin here is the right size for the panel. So all we have to do really is fix the distortions that have occurred. So in order to do that, select all those faces. It's easier in face select mode, I find, but you can do it in vertices, or vertex selection mode, or edge selection mode. Hit U. First check to see that you're facing straight down, so that's hotkey is 7. Hit U, and then project from view bounds. Project from view will give you the same shape, but it will be smaller. Project from view bounds will make sure that these edge vertices here will be on the edges of the image. So you project from view bounds. Now, if we go into textured view, you can see that we are back to having the correct mapping here. We still have this problem where we have these bits kind of warping around. Well, that's pretty easy. And we seem to have selected these on accident. So let's C and middle mouse deselect whatever you select over. So what we're going to do is select inverse, which you can also Control I. Alright. Now grab all of those, and what we're going to do is just scale them down so that they're all just in some black part of the image. We could set up their own material for these bits, but we don't need to. We can just make sure that their UV layout is somewhere where there's nothing showing in the image. So there we go. If we pop back into rendered view, see we've got a nice smoothed edge. The corners are rounded. So yeah, this is looking like a pretty good Star Trek Next Generation style control panel. That was pretty easy. Hit Z, come back into our wireframe mode. Now we're going to start working on the basic shape of the Tribble, and we're going to do that in another layer. So let's click over here, just so we're not distracted by this. Alright, now, again, look at some reference photos for Tribbles. I've already done this. You should always look at reference photos. It makes things much easier. But a Tribble is basically kind of a rounded shape that is a little bit flat on the bottom. So I'm going to Shift A and add a UV sphere. Alright. Now this is going to be covered in hair, so we actually don't need as many segments as this is going to go. So we're going to cut this in half. So 16, 8, and there you go. Because we're not actually going to see this mesh. We're just going to see the hair that's projected from it. So the next thing we're going to do is tab back into edit mode. With the whole thing selected, rotate it, hitting R, then hit X, then just hit 90 to automatically rotate it by 90 degrees. We're doing this because the way that the circle is made with these triangle fans, I want these triangle fans to be on the sides. It just makes it a little bit easier, I think, for the various modifications we're going to make. So again, with the whole thing selected, hit S, Y, and then just bring it out a little bit, because Tribbles aren't perfectly round, they're kind of egg-shaped. They're not very egg-shaped though, so don't go overboard like this, just a little bit. Alright. So next we're going to hit 1 to come into our front perspective, switch it over to vertices, and I like to go into wireframe mode rather than solid, but you can also use this limit selection to visible, click it, and it will deactivate, I guess, and allow you to select vertices behind the ones that you're selecting, the ones you can see here. But I'm just going to go into wireframe, hitting Z, A to deselect everything, B for box select tool. I'm going to select just these vertices that are below the x-axis. So this is where we're going to flatten this out. But first we're going to hit O, and what this gives us here is proportional editing. So if I grab some of these with G, let's say I have this circle, that's the limit of my proportional editing. And so it will modify the vertices surrounding my selection to some lesser degree, which is determined by this fall-off type. Right now it's smooth, which is going to be fine. I find smooth works for almost everything you're doing. If you find it's not working, just experiment with a few others. So we're going to hit S and Z, and we're flattening this out. Don't flatten it out all the way though. Okay. Hit G, and we're going to bring it a little bit back. Actually, we're going to hit Z too, so it's only on the Z axis. Or the Z axis if you're in most of the rest of the English-speaking world. Alright, that's pretty good. So this is our basic Tribble shape. Now, it's going to be much too big, so if I hit Shift and click on the first layer here, you'll notice that this is way bigger than any Tribble should be. And that's okay. We're just going to scale it down. Now, tribbles do vary in size, so it doesn't have to be exact. So just hit S and scale it down until you think it's pretty good size compared to your panel. Alright, not bad. I'm going to hit smooth shading over here just because I like smooth shading. It doesn't actually matter because, again, we're not going to see this actual mesh. Now, another important thing you're going to want to do is apply this size. So if we go over here into the Object Data tab, you can see that my scale here is 0.143. Having a non-1 scale applied makes using the hair system more complicated. So rather than try to deal with that, we're just going to hit Control-A to apply scale. And there we go. Now it's a scale of 1. Right, let's go back into our second layer. Now, we could just apply hair to the entire object, but that's actually wasting some of our time because it's going to be sitting on this bottom section here, right here that's selected. So we don't actually need that to be projecting hair. Although we do want these lines to be projecting hair somewhat. So I'm going to hit Control minus. Oh, wait, no, that's not right. Oh, I forgot what the hotkey is. I'll hit select, and then less. Control number pad minus. I was using my main keyword minus. Alright. So then we're going to go over here into this tab, and we're going to add a vertex group. I'm going to call it hair density. And actually, while I'm here, I'm going to go back to Object and rename this Tribble 0. Generally speaking, you should get into the habit of naming all of your objects something that makes sense, because if you come back to a project after a little while and you have like 4 different objects named cube 0000001, etc., and they're all differently shaped and different kinds of objects, you're going to be very confused when you're trying to figure out what's what. Anyway, back over to the vertex group. So we're going to Control-I to select the inverse of that. And we're going to hit Assign. So what that's going to do is give all of these vertices a value of 1. And it's going to leave these vertices that I don't have selected having a value of 0 on this vertex group. So we can use this to control where the hair is going to project from. So if we go from Edit Mode over to Vertex Paint, or sorry, Weight Paint, you can see you've got red for 1 and this blue for 0 because this is a heat map. Well, that's exactly what we want. Alright, let's go back to Object Mode. So now we're going to go over to Particles. Have a new, we're going to call this Fur, and we're going to call this, not rough, Fur. I promise, I'm not dyslexic. I'm going to change from emitter to hair. Alright, well there you go, that's a Tribble, right? Yeah, no, of course not. First thing we're going to do is bring this length down. Let's bring it to 0.25. Even that's a little bit long. So I'm going to click on here and drag to the left, this left click, until the hair is of an appropriate length for a Tribble. That looks pretty good. Tribbles have somewhat long hair, but it's not excessively long. Next we're going to click on Advanced. This is just where the hair is going to grow. And we're going to go, Faces is good, but we're going to hit Random instead of Jittered. And that just gives it a slightly more natural look. Jittered kind of gives you this grid-like look, and we don't really want that. Next, let's get this hair so that it's only on here using that vertex group that we just set up. So we're going to scroll down until we see Vertex Groups. Click here, and what we want is density. Hair density. Okay, so now we can see that there's no hair projecting from here where we don't need any, and there's plenty of hair projecting from here where we do. But this isn't nearly enough hair. Not even close. So what we're going to do is, we're just going to add a 0 here. Look at that. That's starting to look like a Tribble. Okay. But even so, if you actually saw this, you would think, wow, this Tribble is kind of balding. I mean, you look through and you can see, I guess, what would be the Tribble skin. So we need even more hair. But if we were to just crank this number up, well, basically Blender would just break. So instead, what we're going to use is children. So children takes each actual strand in your hair system and it multiplies it. And these multiples are offset from the original strand, and they can also have deformations based on various factors that you can control. We're going from none to simple. Alright. And we're going to crank down the render number to 20. We don't actually need this many. And let's see. One thing we're going to need to do is the radius is going to have to come down a lot. So it was 0.2. Let's bring it to 0.05. There we go. Now, one of the problems with radius is if you watch and you bring it up too high, you'll see the hairs actually just separate from the mesh and they just go all over the place. So that is why for smaller meshes you need to bring it down. So I'm using the middle mouse wheel to scroll, by the way. Alright, well that's actually looking pretty good. If we go 0, see how it looks. Hit 1. I'm just trying to get a look to see how much outside of the mesh this is projecting. And I bring it up to 10. That's pretty close. Alright, that's good. So now we're going to change these roughness. So roughness is going to add random directionality to this hair. So let's just left click and slide to bring it up. You don't want it too high. So if you bring it up too high, then, again, it starts to go a little crazy with length. Alright. Now let's bring it down a little bit. So this size only works for non-strand hairs. So another thing you can do with hair is, let's say you wanted to have, I don't know, lots of flowers populating a field. Well, you could have a ground object, and then you could use a hair system and have it actually use objects that you've already made that look like flowers, and use those as the hairs. And then you could change the size of the children flowers with this, but with strands it doesn't really do anything. We're also going to go up to endpoint. Bring that up a little bit. Not quite that much. That looks pretty good. Now, with these, there aren't really exact numbers that you're using. They're just, you just use it until, you just move it until it looks good. Now, actually, I'm going to bring down the size a little bit. Let's bring this down to a 0.05. There we go. Okay, so that's looking like a pretty nice hairy tribble. Not bad. Alright, so the next thing we're going to need to do is make a fur material. So hit new, fur. Okay. So let's bring up the node editor. Right click on this, hit X to delete it. We don't need a diffuse shader. We are going to use Shift A to bring up this add menu. Blender is relatively new hair shaders. So add a hair shader, Shift D to duplicate it, G to grab it, Shift A again, and we're going to add a mix shader. And this is just going to be a very simple shader. Let's move this preview over to hair. You can do a lot of things with this offset, roughness, things like that. And if you want to, you can spend hours doing that. And feel free to. That's fine. But just for this tutorial, I'm going to do a pretty simple setup. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a texture. It's going to be a noise texture. And we're going to use this noise texture to make it so that the hair doesn't have all the same color. Alright, so do a converter, color ramp. You take the factor here, plug it into this factor. So now, what this means is this noise texture is controlling how far along the spectrum the color is. Add a couple more points here. Let's grab these, bring them in towards the center just a little bit. Now we're going to click on these colors, and we're actually going to select some various colors. Tribbles tend to come in kind of earth tones, so I'm not straying too far from that. And they tend to have a little bit of white. Alright, so we're going to plug this into the color for both of these. And now, to make sure that it is mapping properly, we're going to add in an input texture coordinate. Now, for most things, you'd probably use generated, and actually, that will probably work. Sometimes you can use camera, object, whatever. And actually, in this case, I think we're going to go with I'll go with object, because I want to have two tribbles, but I don't want them to be identical. By going with object, in a still scene, they'll both look different. Now, one problem sometimes you can run into if you're using object is that if you have an object that is going to deform, so if you have like a character who's going to move or something, the texture will not stay constant across the surface of that object. So be careful when you're using object. Only use it for something that's not going to change shape. Alright. Actually, that will mean that the two tribbles are identical. So, oops. Let's go with, let's just change this object to camera. So now it'll be based on the location of the camera. There we go. They'll be different. Alright. So let's go back to 3D view. Shift click here to bring up our first menu, which also has our first layer, which also has our light. Rendered. Well, it's kind of tribble-ish, but the problem we're having here is the light isn't bright enough. So let's right-click on our lamp. We're actually going to change it to a sun lamp. Sun lamps are generally brighter. I like them a lot because they're relatively simple. Doesn't matter where you place them, but they do have their limitations. They don't work well with volumetrics. They're usually not very good for interior scenes, but I'm doing it anyway because I'm just setting up a simple scene. Feel free to fiddle with lights, use meshes with emission shaders, all sorts of stuff. You use nodes, and we're going to hit 7 to come up right below. And let's actually reposition our camera. And I like to base the direction of the light on the location of the camera, because really what you're doing is you're positioning the light so it looks good through the lens of the camera. So hit 1, Control-Alt-0, and that'll bring me to the camera facing directly forward. And then I'm going to change my pivot point to 3D cursor. Rotate up a little bit. Alright, and then open up a new 3D window, hit 7. The camera's still selected. I'm going to drag it a little bit on the y-axis. Alright, that's pretty good. The reason I do this in a second window is that if I have two windows, I can keep this 3D viewport looking through the camera's view, which, by the way, the hotkey for that is 0. And then I can use these grab operators, or handles, or whatever they are, to move the camera around, so I can both see where it is in 3D space and how it looks through the camera lens at the same time. So this is coming in at a bit of a steep angle, so I'm going to rotate it out a little bit. Change my pivot point back to median point. And actually, I kind of like that angle. It's not bad. Alright, so let's see how our Tribble's looking. It's pretty dark. I wouldn't normally do this, but I think I will this time. Go into Node Editor, click on the Tribble, and let's change this to an add shader. So X to delete the mix shader, Shift A to add, and you know what? I think I like that a little bit better. What I don't like is how yellow this color is. So let's bring it down towards red. Maybe a little bit more. Yeah, I like that better. And of course, I mean, it's your Tribble, you do what you want. You can have it be any color you like. Alright. That's a little bit better. So let's do a little bit more work with lighting. We're going to call this our fill lamp. We're going to give it a slightly blue color. And we're also actually going to get rid of this environment color. I'm not going to be using environment lighting this time. Hit 7 to go back to top view. Shift D to duplicate this lamp. Bring it over here. Now, it doesn't actually matter where your sun lamps are, but I like to position them so that the this line that shows you the direction that they're facing is able to point towards my subject very closely, so that way it's easier for me to kind of eyeball the angle. I'm going to bring this in so that it's at roughly, there we go. Alright, actually, I should probably turn these so that they're lighting this way. Generally speaking, you want your main lights to be lighting from the front of the object. So, that's pretty good. Let's make this a little shallower, just so they're not at exactly 90-degree angles on all axes. Alright. And for this, we're going to call it key lamp. And we're going to keep emission shader, change the strength to 3. And for this color, we're actually not going to use an RGB. What I want to use is a black body. So, if you look at black body, you'll see that what it's basically doing is it's simulating actual black body radiation. I don't know how much you know about physics, but everything radiates electromagnetic energy as it cools down slowly. The wavelength of that energy is dependent on its temperature. And so that means that the hotter something is, the shorter the wavelengths of the energy that it radiates. So as you can see, as I'm moving up this temperature, the color is slightly changing. So humans find 3,750 or so to be a fairly comfortable lighting. That's the color of a lot of that fire tends to give out, although it tends to be a little bit cooler if it's fire. But it's also the color that you tend to get from light bulbs, things like that. The sun is closer to 4,750. But we'll use that. Alright. So let's see how that's looking. One thing is it's hard to see the background here. So I'm going to click over to render settings, go to film, and hit transparent, just so we know where the edges of this control panel are. Alright, that's pretty good. Okay, so now this is a pretty boring shot. You would not want to make this your final render. So one of the things we're going to do is rotate some things. So I'm going to select this and the Tribble, but I'm going to turn off the visibility of the fur. So under here under modifiers, just click the eyeball. That'll just make my viewport run more smoothly. So I hit 3 to go into side view. Hit R, just rotate it a little bit, because if you look at most of the freestanding panels on Star Trek, they are not just level. They are rotated up a little bit for ease of use. So here we go. Let's go back in the camera view. Alright. So it's a little boring having it flat on. So I'm going to hit R and then Z. Rotate it just a little bit. Well, actually, first we're going to make the stands for this table, because that will actually make it easier for me to rotate it more effectively. But we are going to rotate it later. Adding a new cube with Shift A. Hit Z to go to top view. We're going to add in a mirror modifier. Keep it on the x-axis. tab into edit mode, and then we're going to scale it down along both the S and the Z axis. So S, Shift Z. And we also probably want to hit O to take off proportional editing. I'm going to slide it along the X axis, and you can see that now I have a second cube. So that is why we put it on mirrored, because it will mirror it along this X axis based on where the origin is, which was at the center. Okay, so let's go into camera view. We can see that we want these legs to extend down below the line of where the camera is. So we need to bring these down. Alright, next thing we need to do is make sure that they're not poking through the top of our control panel. So just select those front two vertices and bring them down along the Z-axis. There we go. Oh, down along the Z-axis. There we go. Select those two again. Use Shift right-click to keep selecting. These down along the Z-axis. There you go. Now they're hidden. All right. But they're also kind of boring. Let's see if we can make these kind of swept. So I'm going to put a edge loop in here. Now with this edge loop still selected, we're going to hit S, Z, 0. To kind of, actually, you know what? Let's try it without that first. And if we don't like it, we can go back and do it the other way. So select all of these, hit 3 to go back into side view. Bring this back up quite a bit. And then this, I'm just going to bring back a little bit less. Alright. Yeah, I like it with this the diagonal in there, tabbing into edit mode. They still seem a little bit thick, so scale it SX along the X-axis. There we go. That seems a little nicer. Smooth shading. And then we're going to hit Control-2 to bring in some subsurface modifiers. But of course, this looks awful. So what are we going to do? We are going to add in some mean crease, like we thought about doing earlier, but then decided it didn't work. So let's set this to 0.95. See how that looks. Alright, that's not bad for the edge. I'm going to go to face select this, hit Z to go into wireframe, select that. We're going to bring these mean creases to 1. Alright. So now we've got a slight bevel here, and it also smooths out this sweeping angle. Now you can add bevel with the bevel modifier, but it will not smooth out that sweep for you. So the bevel really only works when you want something with very defined straight edges. I find that for anything that is going to have a smooth curve to it, bevel does not work very well. It also tends to work better with relatively low poly meshes. Alright, so let's go into rendered mode and see how that's looking. Alright, I like the look of these. I don't like their material though. So let's add a new material. We're going to call this glossy silver. Switch from diffuse to glossy, obviously. And we're going to bring the roughness 0.2. Alright, that's pretty good. But they're not white enough. I want them to look like they're actually kind of made of a whitish silvery material. So we're going to drag that glossy away, Shift A, add a mix shader, Shift A, add a diffuse shader. There we go. Let's see how that looks now. Oh, I like it. But I'm actually going to bring this up a little bit more. Let's see. That's good enough. Yeah, that'll work. Alright. So go into hit Z to go into wireframe mode. And I do this because I find it easier to select multiple items or multiple objects this way. Hit C to go into our circle select, left click, right there. So we select both the control panel and the Tribble. Right-click to get out of circle select. And now with all of our objects selected, we're going to hit RZ to give it a slight rotation. And you'll notice that if we zoom in down here, that means that now we can see this corner on our control panel leg. We don't really want that, so tab into edit mode and just bring this down again. There we go, that's fine. So now if we go back into rendered view, you can see that this is a little bit more interesting. We get some perspective on it. We catch this reflection better along here from our fill light. We still catch this little reflection here. Overall, this has made this whole scene a little bit more interesting. Okay. So next, I'm going to select the camera. If you're already in camera mode, you can just kind of right-click over at the edge here, or you can select it here from the overview. But we're going to go into the camera settings, and one thing we're going to do is composition guides thirds. This is because we want, I'm going to have two tribbles, one here at this intersection and one off this way. It's not actually going to be at the third mark here, but by being on this third line, it will still be a little bit more interesting visually. So I'm going to right-click on the Tribble, and then over here, where'd it go? Oh yeah, for snap, I'm going to have it snap to the nearest face. So what this will mean is that as I drag it along, it will stay attached to this control panel, which is what I want. I'm hitting Z to go back into solid view. Because otherwise, when I grabbed it, it would just move along the plane, a plane parallel to the camera view, and that would mean it would often come off of this control panel. So hit 0 to go back into camera view. Oh, by the way, shift middle mouse allows you to move and zoom in without going out of camera view. So tip there. So with my snap on, drag it until it's right there at that intersection. And hit Shift D, G, and just move it off to here. Then I'm just going to position my cameras, or well, not the actual camera object, just my viewport perspective. Just facing basically right down on the table, and then I'm going to rotate with R this Tribble, just so they're not facing the exact same direction. Because remember, when you're doing CG, if everything looks perfect, it will look fake. So, and I mean, really, if I wanted to go really realistic with this, I'd add a scratch texture into the control panel so that it wasn't completely smooth, and I'd work on combing the hair particles. But this is just a simple get some basic, decent-looking tribbles into a scene. Go back to rendered view. All right. So we can see that we've got nice reflections from this control panel. If we zoom in here, you can see that, yep, the control panel is actually shedding some of this light that's down here. So yeah, this is looking pretty good. All right. So right now at this point, before we put in the background plane, I actually want to give it a quick render just to see how we're doing. So I'm going to put this to my GPU. Now, depending on your GPU, you'll want to check with Blender's documentation. You may not be able to use GPU. If you can, though, it's usually faster. Let's see, performance. With GPU, you usually want to go about 256 by 256. Sampling. Let's crank it from 10 to 50. And yeah, let's give that a render. So this shouldn't take too long. The hair particles can be a little time consuming, but there actually aren't that many of them. We've got 10,000 on each Tribble multiplied by 20, which for Blender is actually not that many hair particles. It might sound like a lot. You wouldn't want to count them one by one, but yeah, it's actually not too bad. Alright, well, these are looking fairly hairy. This is looking pretty good. Now, you notice that this is very noisy here, and the Tribbles are a little bit noisy. That's going to be cleared up when we do our final render, in which we're going to crank the number of samples up from 50 to probably something more like 200. So, don't worry too much about that. The most obvious way to get rid of noise is always to just increase your number of samples. There are other techniques, but that is not our subject for today. Alright, but of course, this background is really boring. I mean, it's just alpha. You could put it over anything, I guess. But let's add something to the scene. So back in 3D, Shift A and do another mesh, images as planes, and let's see, I believe it was still in my images folder. There was an image of the, here we go. Nope, that's my final from the old the tutorial practice run I did. Oh, here it is. Max res default. Alright, so this is just an image of an engine from Next Generation. Engine room. Oh, let's take it off snap. So put this little magnet RX90. Now, since we already have this other window here open, I'm going to switch to a 3D view so I can get a top-down. Slide this back. And we want it to be fairly far away because we're actually going to blur it out. So, scale it up with S, scale it a bit more, bring it down a bit. Alright, let's look at that in rendered view. So, that's not bad, although it's a little dark because it is a diffuse shader. So, the lighting there is based on the lighting from the lamps that we have in the scene. We don't want that. We want this to be an emission shader so that it is not dependent on those lamps. So, switch to emission. You can immediately see that it becomes brighter. Now, we could try bringing up the brightness, and as we do that, it might actually give us some backlighting here. So, if we went crazy with it, you'd see that, yeah, you get a lot of lighting in the back here. But, of course, that also makes the image look terrible. So, let's see where it still looks good. 3 is not bad, and if we compare it to 0, you can see that there is some lighting back here. So we'll go 3. Alright, now the next thing we need to do is we need to give this some depth of field. So depth of field is basically just kind of your focus. So where your focal point is, it will be sharp. And where your focal point isn't, it will be blurry. So selecting the camera again. Select it here. Back into camera, and here we got depth of field. So for focus, I'm going to use the cube, which we should have named control panel or something, but what can I say? Sometimes I have bad habits. So now that's going to be our focal point, and I go back and forth between f-stop and radius. With f-stop, lower means stronger depth of field, with radius, higher means higher depth of field. So if I were to go to like 0.1, you can see there's a very strong depth of field effect. That seems a little extreme because it's even getting blur here at this forward edge of this control panel. And we want the control panel to be mostly sharp. So let's bring it down to 0.05. Alright, that's still introducing a slight amount of blur here, but I kind of like it. So we'll leave it there. But I don't actually think that this is blurred quite as much as I'd like. I want it to feel a little bit blurrier. So bring it back along the y-axis. Then I'm just going to scale it up again so it fills our frame. Alright, that's not bad. Okay. So that's basically it. We've now created a simple scene with some tribbles. Now, this is not a great award-winning scene or anything. This is just to give you the basics of, some easy modeling techniques, using some subdivisions, using some mean crease, setting up a very basic hair system, background planes. So yeah, it's really just giving you some extremely basic techniques. But it was requested that I do a Blender tutorial, so here it is. Up this to 200% or 200 samples, and we're going to render. See how it looks. This actually should not take very long. The last one took, what, 16 seconds? This should take, significantly longer than that because we're doing, oh, you know what we didn't do? We did not bring the resolution up to 100%. Let's do that. Resolution to 100%, which basically quadruples the size of your image, because at 50% it cuts both the X and the Y in half, and, well, geometry. You cut both the X and the Y in half on a square, and it shrinks by a quarter. So this will actually make it easier to see the individual hairs and things like that, although this one's a little bit out of focus, which is fine. So yeah. Now you can see that it takes a lot longer to render these tiles when there's the Tribble in there, and that's because all the other materials in the scene and all the geometry in the scene is very simple. But not these Tribbles. These Tribbles are complicated. Now, this line that you've got going down here, that's basically just because the mesh underneath is rather low poly. If you want to fix that, you can subdivide the surface with like a level 2 subdivision, so just click on one of the Tribbles. Okay. Go over to modifiers, add in a subdivision surface modifier, and then make sure it's on top of the particle system using these arrow keys to move down the modifiers. And then in the particle system, you just want to make sure you click Use Modifier Stack, so that way it will actually take into account the subdivision. And that will get rid of this kind of striated appearance that you get on this Tribble, which is also on this Tribble. But I actually kind of like that. It kind of makes it look like they have stripes of color somewhere. But yeah, that's our image. Now you can see it's still noisy down here, but it's not as noisy, and we get a few little fireflies here. You can fix those you can fix that manually. You can crank up your samples, but I'm going to call that good. So then we just hit F3 to save it, and we can call it Tribbles. Save as image. And there you go. We have created a few basic Tribbles on a nice next generation style control panel in front of a cool warp core. Well, thanks for watching.